Hello, this is Tony Christ, and I'm with Ishmael Modney, and welcome to this show called Sunshine and Transparency. Uh, I can some notes before we get going on our topic today, which incidentally has changed. Next week we're going to do a special show the day before Christmas on God. It's going to be a philosophic show, not a religious show. We'll discuss the three major religions, and it should be something of interest. You might want to tune in if you have some time. We've changed the show next week and this week, and we're postponing our discussion on the economy and investments till to begin again the week before the new year. So that will be the Sunday before the new year. So right now we've changed today because of what happened in the hearings the beginning of last week of the three university presidents. And we want to discuss today a very major cultural change that's been in the works likely for decades, maybe going back to when Ishmael, a millennial, was in school, the changes started. At least I see them starting there. And we want to discuss it. This week, three university presidents were questioned in in a congressional hearing, and they were asked the question of calling for genocide of the Jewish race a violation of your institution's code of ethics, and none of them could say yes. And that sort of alarmed me. So we want to discuss DEI, wokeness, and the cultural changes that are going on. We're not going to focus on colleges per se, but we're going to discuss them in general. Now, Ishmael, first of all, you're in the younger generation. Uh, what do you think about that statement that no university president could say that genocide of the Jewish race is in violation of their institution's code of ethics? I mean, ethical codes are generally pretty strict. Ethics is the definition of what makes us human. So, what do you feel about that? Can you talk about it for a couple minutes?
Sure. I think number one, the answer should have been yes, it is a violation of our ethical code, as is the calling of genocide of anyone, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Chinese or Uyghur or you name it. Calling for genocide explicitly is against our code of conduct. It's against our ethics, period. That's simple. I think then number two, I would have pushed back on the premise of the questioning, understanding you're in a congressional hearing and it's a gotcha moment, and asked, can you give me an example when students actually explicitly called for the genocide of the Jewish people? Because that hasn't happened. And I think the college presidents got caught up way too much in that. There's been incendiary speech, there's been very passionate speech, and it's what we do encourage, but specifically calling for genocide against Jewish people absolutely violates ethical codes. It's a very simple answer. But I would have added that as a caveat at the end that Congresswoman Stefanski, can you please point out where our students have called for genocide?
And it's somewhat concerning that none of these overwhelming groups largely on campuses even are mentioning the slaughters that initiated the whole situation that you're discussing about the original slaughters of people of Jewish people, which was very inhuman and very violent, and the situation is still brewing in the world. I mean, there have been over almost 100 attacks on either U.S. military bases, and now they're transferring to the shipping lanes in the Red Sea. And some of the major shipping companies, just as a point of interest, I heard this morning, have stopped shipping because of the problems. And I also heard an opinion this morning that within the next week, the U.S. will be changing its policy and will start to go after more aggressively some of the Yemen sites that are initiating these attacks, which they're definitely just a proxy to Iran. So this is an unfolding process. It's a very concerning process. It's very alarming to hear college students, let alone college students at elite universities, talking about erasing or annihilating any group of people. It's just so counter to academics and what education's all about. So I want to
I
discuss.
mean, I think though, real quick there, to be fair, is there hasn't been an explicit call for that. And number two, I mean, you were in school during the Vietnam War, and I'm sure you saw it as well. Just those who were more so supporting on college campuses the end of the war, downright supporting the North Vietnamese and the communists. And yeah, there may be parallels to that, but I don't know, unless I'm mistaken, I'm very open to it. If there's been clear, sustained calls that would require a college president to say one way or not, the other, and this is from any side of it.
Well, you're right. I stood in protest lines against the Vietnam War at William and Mary years, 55 years ago. But there wasn't any call supporting that I'm aware of any significant supporting North Korea or anyone else or North Vietnam or anyone else in that group that I was aware of. Anyway, let's get on and talk about DEI, and I want to give you a perspective on discrimination that I labored through during college as a boomer, and to view everything through, and hopefully to differentiate between what's going on today and maybe a more sensible course. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. While they're three words that aren't innocuous, they all can have very positive applications in America. They're being used very broadly. They're being used by political entities locally and statewide. They're being used by businesses. They're being used in advertising. They're affecting advertisers. They're affecting the people that are chosen to do ads. So there's a very broad use of them, and everyone has their own purpose or their own use reason for using them. But what do they mean in their essence, and are they possibly destructive? And I believe there's evidence they are. Diversity is broadly adopted in communities and education centers across the nation. Public education bureaucracies have adopted it. On its face, it seems fair, stating that all human differences should be represented in the workplace. This includes differences like religion, ethnicity, creed, sex, gender, and more. And on that face, does that make sense? I mean, how do you represent them in the labor force? I mean, should they be represented as a percentage of what they are in the population, or should they be represented overweight, as affirmative action does by, for example, today the U.S. government has 16.6% of workers are Afro-American when there's only 12.6% in the population. That's a 32% overrepresentation. Is that fair to do that? Now, mind you, when we are raising a question about affirmative action, we're not questioning civil rights. We all think civil rights are very important and very basic and elemental. I was even at Martin Luther King's speech in Washington back in the 60s. It dates me, tells you how old I am. In any case, it has nothing to do with civil rights. So affirmative action, now where does affirmative action stop? Does it go on to gender? Does it go on to sexual preferences? Does it go on to religious preferences? Where does it stop? So diversity, the way it's being applied, leaves open an infinite amount of possibilities that are essentially subjectively determined by a decision maker, which is always scary. You don't necessarily want a person in a decision position to make that determination. So it's somewhat troubling. Now, equity is equally troubling. It addresses structural inequality. Now, we're not all born equally. And where in the Judeo-Christian culture, if you have hope and opportunity, which we argued on our last podcast, you still need a bit of luck to get to have things go your way. But you definitely need hope and opportunity, and you would rise in a Judeo-Christian ethic. You will rise. Now you may start with almost nothing, but is there an obligation in this new cultural presentation to equalize things that are unequal? And how could that be done? And isn't that pure Marxism? Isn't that the Marxist fantasy? And it is a fantasy. Then, and many people are attracted to it. Don't get me wrong. That everybody should be, that all material possessions should be equal in the world. Now, so all of a sudden, it goes beyond diversity and recognizing that, and then you get to inclusion, that various groups should be included, various religious groups, various others should be included. So those three words together, to me, can attack maybe the most sacred and fundamental thing that we have in our system, which is a merit-based system. And if you devalue that, and a merit-based system discriminates. It discriminates, but it discriminates on a narrow ground. If you're a fifth grader and you're in your arithmetic class, you do the problem correctly, you get a credit. You do it wrong, you're wrong. And it's an objective sort of a measure, and it goes all the way up and down the ladder. And it should be applied. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But when you the economist I want to bring into this discussion is Gary Becker. Many years ago, I became critical of definitions of, including the Supreme Court's definition of discrimination. I thought they were fairly subjective and left to opinion. And if you look at all the litigations over it, you probably would agree with me. It's taken quite a bit of litigation to try to pin it down, and it still is not as precise as, say, mathematics. Well, Gary Becker is an economist, and I always thought that he did win the Nobel Prize in 1992. I always thought he had a very good definition that maybe should be revisited with the current situation, with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, becoming a mantra for changing the economic structure. Becker said, you choose to discriminate when you make a choice, say in labor, of a person that is less able over a person that's more able. Well, what do I mean? Well, let's say two people want to get a job that's purely a typist job, and one types 120 words a minute, and the other types 80 words a minute, and you pick the one at 80 words a minute. Well, you've discriminated 40 words a minute, and you've actually hindered your productivity by making that discrimination. Now, I'm not that concerned about that kind of behavior in public companies, in private companies, excuse me. I am concerned about it in public government entities because we pay for them. We pay for government entities. Why am I not concerned for it in private companies? Because eventually other companies who aren't discriminating will beat them out, who are choosing on merit the best person for the job. So basically, I view DEI as the new culture that's appearing at universities as an attack on merit. And merit is the very basic underpinning of our social system. It's not perfect, but it's carried us to this point. And I might add, there are other systems in the world that have copied us to a T, even though we've gotten away from it. If you look at the recently released international PISA tests given to 15-year-olds, you'll see that we went up in English and we went up in our standing, but we went down in mathematics. We're now ranked 34th in the world in mathematics. If you look at countries like India, China, Singapore, they're at the top of the list. Very many countries. We're down with a group of countries I don't even recognize half of them. So, and we are the second most expensive K through 12 education system in the world. And we're ranking 34th in mathematics. That's not a good sign. We were peerless in the world when when I went to school in the 1960s and 1950s too, actually. So basically, it should be a red flag. It should be a concern. If we're getting away from merit, where are we going? What does that bode? Are we investing in our youth? Are we giving them the chance to get out there and succeed today with this sort of confusing DEI structure that most every K through 12 school is using? I think not. What do you think, Ishmael?
Well, one, I think that, I appreciate the overview, which I think was a pretty solid one. And reading Becker's work last night, I do fundamentally agree with that thesis of, if you are discriminating, at the end of the day, especially if you're a private business, it's not going to work out. However, I do have a different point of view overall. Overall, when you do look at history and the statistics of how we got here, again, as I will say, 86% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men. 37 top 50 are white men, and that's just 70% of C-level executives in Fortune 500 companies are white men. And to me, I feel we have addressed the problems at the bottom. So in your typist example, for the most part, those problems aren't as prevalent anymore. The best person gets the role because it's much easier to see who the best person is. It doesn't matter what they look like or where they come from or who they are. Most people, and myself who hires pretty frequently, will ensure to hire the most qualified. I think where the challenge still is, and why DEI is important and why we need to continue to push on it, and from my perspective, is at the top. Leadership is still overall homogenous.
So you don't think because they're a dominance of white males, you don't think they're done on merit?
We still are overweighted there. I think again,
why do you even care? Wouldn't that come up in the companies that are done by merit? Won't they succeed where the others will fail?
I think
unions in the private sector are terrible.
I think it's an interesting thought, because getting to the top takes more than just objective merit. Again, it's easy when you're comparing words of typing or how many bricks are laid down, or again, as I mentioned to you before, athletics. Athletics is a great place. You know who's faster. You know who can throw a faster fastball. But getting to the top leadership roles, there is politicking. There is, are you invited into the right rooms? There is, do you know the right person? And I think this is where, again, I'll give my favorite example is the NFL, where you can tell who the best players are. That's objective. But the best coaches, it is still a league where I believe 28 of 32 head coaches are white men. And not to say they're qualified or not, but my favorite example is Tony Dungy, who was a Hall of Famer, and he himself, who is more conservative than not in this regard, but it took him way longer to get that opportunity. So to me, I don't think you can, the way I view this and the way others, I don't think, number one, you can ever equalize for outcome.
Well, how about
you can't, but you can for opportunities. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think you can, but I mean, you have Ben Carson. We can go on and on with the list. You have Jamie Dimon, whose ancestors were in the Christian Holocaust in Turkey. You have the guy that started Interactive Brokers. You have just every day another one's coming up. Obama, who became president. If you want to focus on at least a half Afro-American race, he wasn't even 100%. But I mean, there are so many people that have improved their lives that are minorities that came up.
Absolutely.
That you in a closed system, you've never seen it. You'd have never, in Russia, if you were in China, if you were in a closed system,
absolutely,
unless you're in the party,
and 100%. 100%. I
So,
completely
but
agree with you
as you
there.
say, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect system.
No,
But
it isn't perfect, and it's better than most. I will say that we have much better here than, we've both been around the world, and I'd rather take our system than others. To me, it is how do we, and the way I view DEI is how do we just open up that pipeline? So to your point, you get more Jamie Dimons, you get more, and this, by the way, is not just how you look or where you're from, but how much money you grew up with. If you tended to have parents who were wealthy, you already have a leg up. How do we get to your point? And I like pointing to your cousins who are
as long
absolutely brilliant. And I think to your point, they
they
should
didn't
have
have
the
any money.
opportunity.
They didn't
They
have
had
any
zero
money.
money and they made it,
They all
right?
went to Harvard.
But those, yep, absolutely. And
But
those tend to be the
But
exceptions today.
today you don't see that. My concern is that that the college level and K through 12 level is much more ignorant. They're not as focused on academics. When I see mathematics sinking, when we go from peerless in America to 34th in the world, and we're spending like second in the world, it's telling me there's a huge failure,
Yep.
in our ability to invest in the next generation. Because the
And
only
I think there's a huge failure in standards as well. To your point, and I love George W. Bush's quote on this. I will say this. He talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations, which I completely agree with. And I think we are both aligned on that we should have high expectations for everyone, regardless of how much money you were born with, regardless of color of skin, etc. But can we get that pipeline wider and more diverse?
Well, you can't do it unless you address the problems. And the problems are, in my opinion, the fatherlessness today, the broken homes today, are just, and we've covered them, and I don't want to go back over it all. But the kids are coming out, they're not super motivated, they're not full of hope and seeking opportunity. And then the environment itself has reduced opportunity. But it's very troubling to me to see that college educated kids today are nowhere near the standard they were 50 years ago coming out of colleges and universities. And they act more tribally. They're not academically motivated. And that's a very troubling sign. Now, we stayed on this long enough. We wanted to raise the flag on it because of what happened this week. I thought to have three of the top schools in the United States to have their presidents adhering to policies and tolerating behaviors on campus that went beyond anything I've seen, even though, as Ishmael pointed out, there were quite a few demonstrations against the Vietnam War, but to preach, and that's what they're doing in their signs they're carrying, annihilation of a whole ethnic group. I don't think anyone was doing that when I was in school, and that's happening today. And
I don't think it's happening though. I think that's where I disagree with the premise.
from the river to the sea means wiping out all.
I don't think it does. I don't think it does. I think it can be interpreted that way, but
that's what they say.
I don't think it does.
I
don't think it does.
That's what they're saying.
I mean, I've heard it, but I would not.
Well,
when we see the actual actions
right,
that are happening, I would not consider that genocide. Now, would I say it myself? No. But do I think that's saying annihilate Israel? No.
Well, I got to take them at their word, and that's what they're saying, and that's what they're writing on their signs. So anyway, it's a matter for serious concern. There are huge problems around. We're just about done with DEI. To me, it may as well be DIE, die. It's the worst thing that I've seen for the Judeo-Christian culture that we grew up in, which was merit-based. Nothing's 100% equal, but so many people I've known over the years have come up through it and had successful lives. I've got to feel like it's the most successful culture in the history up until now. And I think now it's having very severe problems. And they relate, like we've said before, back to family and everything. We have a very big show next week. on God. And he certainly is a part of this, he or she, I'm not sure, but
He,
it's going to
say
be
he.
it's going to be a philosophical show. It's not going to be a religious show. We're going to have a frank talk about him on Christmas Eve, and we want you to join. We hope you'll listen to you'll listen to the podcast, and we hope you'll be back with us next week. It's good to see you. We will be on live eventually, and looking forward to that. And we hope you'll stay tuned with us. We wish you all to have a blessed week, and thank you for tuning in to our show. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.